Hi sewers, welcome to my studio. I'm Sasha, I'm a fashion designer and teacher, and today I have a tutorial and a sewing pattern showing you how to make these super cute dungarees with side ties.
1, 2, 3, 4.
How to sew side-tie dungarees, a step-by-step tutorial with sewing pattern. If you'd like to sew along, you can find the pattern in my Etsy store and I'll pop the link down below. There's two style options for this pattern, and you can either have ties at the waist only, which gives a really feminine and flattering look to the design and also gives a contrast to the wide and relaxed leg shape. Or you can also add ties at the ankle for a more tapered leg look, which is also perfect for cycling if you ride a bike regularly like me. I'd say this project is an intermediate make. It's quite simple overall, but there are lots of small stages that go into it, meaning it's a bit of a longer sew than my previous patterns. Of course, I'll be guiding you through the process in lots of detail in this video, but you might find these dungarees a little bit of a challenge as an absolute beginner or as a first garment project. But I'm going to be showing you some really great techniques that will be transferable to other projects, such as how to make fabric ties and how to make your own bias binding and get a really nice finish with it. So let's take a closer look at the dungarees on the stand and talk about some of the design details so we know where we're headed before we get started. Side-tie dungarees design details. The biggest unique feature of these dungarees is the ties at the side here. They allow you to draw the dungarees in at the waist for a more fitted and feminine shape, and they also allow you to adjust the fit to your size on any given day, which is great if, like me, your waist size can fluctuate a little bit over the month. Or if you're just going out for a big meal and you want to eat all the things and know you'll be comfortable. And then you also have the option to add another set of ties at the ankle if you prefer a more tapered look to the leg, or if you're a cyclist like me. There's no right or wrong to your choice here, it really just depends on which look you like the most. I've got pairs in both styles and I love both depending on the day. I'd say leaving the leg wide, like on this pair, gives a slightly smarter, more classic appearance, but I love the cuteness and practicality of the ankle ties too. If you're going for the waist ties only, there's 4 in total. 2 on the front and 2 on the back. And if you're adding the ankle ties, there's another 2 at each side, so 8 in total. I've made my ties on both of these versions by adding lining fabric on the reverse, as I love the little pop of contrast to highlight the bows. But you can use your main body fabric on both sides of the tie if you like a more monochromatic look. Next, let's have a look at the pockets. We've got one big pocket here on the front bib, and that's constructed by sandwiching the pocket piece into these seams that run down the front of the body. And I've used that same lining on the inside. For this part, I would recommend that you use lining rather than your main body fabric, as the finer weight of the lining cuts down on some of the bulk in the seams, and the contrast won't be visible at all from the outside. There's also inseam pockets at the hip on each side. The facing is grown onto the side pieces for these, and the bags are made out of your lining. Moving round to the back leg pieces extend up across the body to connect to the straps, and the straps have a classic dungaree construction with a buckle and a slider to adjust the length. You can find all the hardware pieces online in lots of different finishes, and if you've never made dungaree straps before, they're actually much easier to put together than they look. The buttons are the type that you also see on jeans, and they're also really easy to put in because there's no sewing needed. You simply hammer them in place with a small tack at the back, which I'll show you exactly how to do in the tutorial. And finally, if we have a look at the inside of the dungarees, we can see that the tops are turned through with bias binding finished facings, and we also have that same bias binding forming a neat edge around the sides here. I like to make my own bias binding out of the same lining fabric that I use on the ties and the pockets, as I think it pulls everything together really neatly. But you can also use pre-made bias binding here if you'd like to save a little bit of time. So that should give you a better idea of where we're headed with the make. So now let's have a look at which fabrics work best for the project. Side-tie dungarees, fabric choices. For this project, you'll need your main body fabric, which will form the majority of the dungarees, and then you'll need some lining fabric, which we'll use for the pockets and also the ties if you want to have the contrast look like me. A small amount of interfacing that we'll use to strengthen the facings and reinforce the button area, and the dungaree hardware, the buckles, sliders, and hammer-on buttons. You'll also then need some extra lining to make bias binding with, or some pre-made bias binding if you prefer not to make your own. The quantities needed for each material vary depending on your size and the fabric width. and you can find out all the information you need to make sure you get the right amount in the instructions. So let's take a look at the main body fabric first of all. For both the pairs I've made up here, I've used a fine cotton needle cord. If you're not familiar with that term, needle cord just means that the lines of the cord are very narrow, as opposed to, say, a jumbo cord that has really chunky lines. Needle cord tends to be a little bit easier to handle than chunkier cords because there's less slip to the pile on the surface, meaning it doesn't move around too much as you sew, making it a great choice for beginners if you want to try out cord for the first time. In terms of properties, it's really important that the fabric you choose for this project is non-stretch, and medium weight fabrics work best. So by that, I mean you want to avoid fabrics that are very lightweight or slippy, such as chiffon or viscose challis. And at the other end of the scale, you should also avoid fabrics that are very heavy, such as very heavyweight denim or brocade, as the waist is gathered in at the sides. So if the fabric is very heavy, it will create a lot of bulk there, which we don't want. So basically, you're looking for fabrics that fall somewhere in the middle weight-wise. We want them to have a certain amount of stiffness or structure, enough to support the smart shape and hardware, but also a certain amount of softness to allow them to be gathered easily and comfortably, which actually gives quite a lot of scope for fabric options. So a few examples that would work are needle cord, like I'm using here, denim, as long as it's non-stretch and not super heavy, chambray, which is like a lightweight denim and gorgeous for a summer pair. Midweight cottons, so something like a poplin, seersucker or gingham would work better than, say, a fine cotton lawn. Most linens would be great. And the pattern will also work with a suiting weight wool if you want to make a smarter pair or a pair for the colder months. Or if you want to try something a bit more glam, a soft velvet or a lightweight brocade would be really fun too. For the lining, we'll be using this for the inside of the pockets, which will be hidden from the outside, and also for the reverse of the ties if you want to add a flash of contrast, although you can also use the main body fabric on both sides of the ties if you prefer. Any type of lining will work for this, so it can be matte, satin, viscose poly, silk or cotton, and just go with what you like the look of best next to your main body fabric. Next we have bias binding, which is used inside the dungarees to finish the raw edges of the side and the facings. I like to use the same lining to make my own, as I think it brings the finish together really neatly. And if you'd like to do the same, I've included binding patterns to do this, and I'll show you my favourite method in the tutorial. It is an extra process though, so if you want to save a little bit of time, or if you just find making bias binding a little bit fiddly, you can use 1/2 inch wide pre-made bias binding instead. And if you're using pre-made binding, either the satin or cotton type will work, just as long as it's 1/2 inch wide. For the interfacing, we'll be using that to strengthen our facings for a crisp finish and support the hammer-on buttons. I always recommend woven interfacing over the non-woven papery kind that you can get, as although you'll pay a little bit more money for it, the quality is so much better, and it makes your projects much more durable to time and washing. Plus, you normally only need a small amount for each project, so spending a little bit more on a good quality interfacing is always a good investment. And finally, we have our hardware, which is what we call the metal pieces, which give us that classic dungaree look. These are really easy to find online in lots of different finishes, and you can often find them listed as sets, so you can buy all the pieces you need in one go. Or if you're looking as individual items, this part is called a dungaree buckle, this part is a slider or dungaree slider, and the buttons are most often referred to as jeans buttons or hammer-on buttons. For the slider and buckle, the most important thing is to make sure that the feed-through size, which is this part here, is 40mm or 1.5 inches, as that's the width of our strap. For the buttons, the shank, which is the part that the buckle fits around, is normally pretty standard in size. So the different sizes you see refer to the size of the metal disc at the top. I've used 17mm ones on mine, but 14 or 20mm ones would work as well if you prefer the look of a bigger or smaller button. If you're using velvet or needle cord like me, one thing to note is that the pile of the fabric gives the cloth a different look depending on its direction. So you probably know with this type of fabric, if you run your hand across the surface, it feels smooth in one direction and rough in the other, which is due to the tiny hair fibres which make up the surface. But what you might not know is that the direction of these fibres also affect how the light hits the cloth. So if you cut the fabric with the pile running down the body, it will feel smooth to the touch when wearing, but the colour will appear slightly lighter as the direction of the hairs reflects the light. If you cut the fabric the other way, so the pile runs upwards on the body, it will feel a bit rougher to the touch but give the colour a much richer appearance, as it absorbs the light so makes it appear more pigmented. And this tends to be the preference when using velvet in traditional tailoring. There's no right or wrong when it comes to making a choice with this. It just comes down to personal preference. I cut these with the pile going upwards as I loved the colour pop in the pink. And you can see the difference here with the pile going down on this piece of cloth and up on my dungarees. If you're not sure, the best thing to do is to hold the cloth up against you in the mirror in the two different directions to see how it looks and feels and make the decision of what you like best from there. Side-Tie Dungarees Project Basics. If using pre-made bias binding, skip step 4 of this tutorial and move straight from step 3 to step 5. Directions are given for both tie versions as needed throughout the tutorial. Standard stitch is a straight stitch with a length of 2.5mm unless otherwise stated. Seam allowance is 1 cm unless otherwise stated. I'll be using my serger to finish the raw edges of my seams throughout this tutorial, but if you don't have access to a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch on a regular sewing machine to do exactly the same thing, stopping fraying of the fabric edges and making your garment long-lasting and durable. To finish your edges with zigzag stitch on a regular sewing machine, set your stitch length to 2 and your stitch width to 5. Then sew right up to the raw edge of your fabric as shown in red on the diagram. So let's get started with the project. Step 1. Assemble sewing pattern. For this pattern, I advise opening the file in Adobe Acrobat Reader, which is a program that allows you to view your individual size on the pattern only. You can download Adobe Acrobat Reader for free, and I'll add a non-sponsored link in the description below. When you open the file in Adobe Acrobat, click the Layers icon to reveal the Layers tab, and you'll see the pattern sizes presented as a layer list here. The base layer is locked as this contains the information needed for all sizes. You'll then have the option to hide or reveal the individual sizes by clicking the checkbox next to them. When a size is visible, you'll see an eye icon in the checkbox, and when it's hidden, the box will be empty. As there's quite a lot of guide markings on this pattern, showing only the size you want to make and hiding the others makes the pattern a lot easier to read. Now print out your pattern, being careful to print at 100% scale and checking the scale guide on the first page against your tape measure to be sure. Next, cut each page along the purple boundary lines as needed and stick the tiles together with tape or glue using the tile map in the instructions as a guide. Then cut each pattern piece along your chosen size and you'll have 16 pieces in total. Back, side front, front bib, front pocket, back facing, front facing, pocket, shoulder strap, waist tie, ankle tie, side binding, facing binding, and a tiny piece for button interfacing. Make sure to punch out the marked holes on the pattern pieces. There are 7 each of these on the side front and side back, and 1 on the back facing piece. To make the dungarees with waist ties only, you can discard the ankle tie piece or save it for later. And if you're using pre-made bias binding, you can discard both the side binding and facing binding pieces or save them for later. Step 2. Pattern adjustments. The pattern is drafted to have a finished leg length of 38 to 41 inches from waist to trouser hem dependent on size. You can find a lengthen shorten here line on the front, back, side front and side back pattern pieces to adjust the leg length as needed. To lengthen the leg, cut the front pattern along the adjustment line and tape another piece of paper below it. Then draw a parallel line below the adjustment line on the new piece of paper. The distance between the lines should be the amount you wish to lengthen the dungarees by. For example, a 3-inch distance for a 42-inch finished leg length on the small size. Mark the distance evenly along the line with a tape measure and join the markings with a ruler. Extend the grain line from the top of the pattern to meet the new line, then stick the bottom part of the front pattern along the new line, matching the grain lines up to make sure the pattern remains straight. Draw lines to connect the sides of the pattern along the extension and cut down to size. Then repeat the process on the back, side and side front pattern pieces, making sure to extend by the same amount on each one. To shorten the leg, draw a parallel line above the adjustment line. The distance between the lines should be the amount you wish to shorten the dungarees by. For example, a 3-inch distance for a 36-inch finished leg length on the small size. Then fold the pattern, bringing your new line and the adjustment line to meet and tape into place. Draw lines to even out the new sides of the pattern and trim down if needed. Then repeat the process for the back and side front pattern pieces, making sure to shorten by the same amount on each one. I've also included a line on the pattern to make a dungaree shorts version. To do this, simply cut along the line marked for shorts on the back, front, back and side front pieces. If you're making the shorts version, it's a good idea to save the lower part of the pattern pieces so you can rejoin them to make a full leg length version later on without reprinting. The waist for each size of the dungarees is adjustable on the finished garment, so no pattern adjustments should be necessary here. Step 3. Cut fabric. Make sure to iron your fabric first with plenty of steam at an appropriate heat for your fabric type. Then fold your fabric in half with the right sides facing, matching up the selvages as closely as possible. Then lay your pattern pieces onto the fabric using the cutting lays in the instructions as a guide, and making sure the grain line on each piece runs parallel to the selvage. When you're happy with your lay, pin into place and cut out each piece as close to the edge of the pattern paper as possible. Take care to mark the notches on all your pieces and the position of the punch holes with chalk. You'll find 7 punch holes each on both the side front and side back pieces that will help us sew the pockets later on, and one at the top centre of the back facing piece. As the front pocket is similar to the front bib but slightly smaller, you can cut a pair of front bib pieces when your fabric is on the fold, then separate and pin the front pocket piece to one of the front bib fabric pieces and cut down to size following the pattern. Next, take your lining fabric and fold it in half, matching the selvages. You'll need to cut out 1 piece for the front pocket, 2 pairs for the pockets, and 2 pairs each for the waist and ankle ties if you're going for the flash of contrast lining like on mine. If you're making your ties without contrast, you'll need additional pairs of the tie pieces in your main body fabric instead. If you're making your own bias binding, you'll also need to cut out a pair of side binding and facing binding pieces using the patterns provided. Make sure to follow the grain line for these so that the pieces are sitting diagonally across the fabric on what we call the bias. And finally, take your interfacing and cut out a piece for your back and front facings and a pair for your shoulder straps and button interfacing. Step 4. Self-made bias binding. If you're using a pre-made bias binding, you can skip this stage and move straight on to step 5. There's a few different ways to make bias binding, but this one is my favourite. Personally, I prefer not to use the bias tape tools you can get that look like this, as I find them a little fiddly and hard to get an even result with, especially when working with lighter fabrics such as lining, and you often end up with pinches in the fabric like this. Instead, I find a really foolproof way to make a double fold binding is to first fold your binding piece in half and press firmly along the fold with your iron. Then open the piece and fold and press one of the raw edges at the side in to meet the fold in the middle. Continue the whole way along the strip, then take the second raw edge and fold it in to meet the first raw edge in the middle. So it should now look like this. Then give it a last press from the front to get it really nice and crisp, and the finished result should look like this and measure 1/2 inch wide in total. Step 5. Iron-on interfacing. This is a small step, but I like to iron on all my interfacing pieces at the beginning before I start sewing, so I don't miss out or lose any of the interfacing pieces along the way. For this design, you'll need to fuse interfacing to 1 pair of the shoulder straps. The other pair will remain in fabric only. Both facing pieces are interfaced, and make sure you can still see the punch hole mark on the back facing after fusing, and remark if needed. And then the small button interfacing pieces sit at the top of the side front pieces, with a 1 cm gap between the edge of the interfacing and the edge of the cloth. Step 6. Sew ties. Match 1 fabric tie piece and 1 lining tie piece up with the right sides facing together, or 2 fabric tie pieces if you're using your main body fabric on both sides of the ties. Match the edges exactly and pin them together with the pins at right angles to the cloth so you can leave them in while sewing. And repeat the process for each of your ties. If you're making the version with waist ties only, you'll end up with 4 pinned pairs in total. And if you're making the version with ankle ties too, you'll have 8 pinned pairs, with the ankle ties being slightly shorter. We're now going to sew the ties together around the 3 sides shown in the diagram in one continuous stitch line. Start at the top right of each piece with a backstitch and sew down the long edge with a straight stitch with a length of 2.5 and a 1 cm seam allowance. As you approach the corner, stop 1 cm before the end of the fabric. Then lower the needle into the cloth to secure the fabric before lifting the presser foot and pivoting anti-clockwise to sew along the bottom edge of the tie. Then repeat that process at the next corner, using the needle as a pivot to spin the fabric anti-clockwise again to sew back down the other long edge of the tie. Keep sewing until you get to the end of the line and end with a backstitch. Then repeat this process for each of your ties. Press each tie nice and flat with your iron. Then trim each of the seam allowances down to about 4 mm. So the tie will now look like this. And chop the pointed corner of each piece, being careful to cut close to but not through your stitches. We're now going to turn our ties the right way round using a chopstick or something similar. Start by separating the 2 sides of the tie from each other a little bit. Then fold the sealed end of the tie up into the gap between the pieces and use the chopstick to push the end further along the cavity into the tie. Then work the rest of the fabric down over the chopstick, wiggling it along at the sides. It can be a little tricky to get this started, but you should get to a point where the cloth will start to move easily. When the right side of the end of the tie becomes visible at the top, use the end of the chopstick to gently push the 2 corners out and into shape. Then remove the chopstick and pull the rest of the cloth down the right way out. So the tie will now look like this. Then press each tie into shape with your iron, rolling the edges out so the stitch line is sitting right at the edge, not tucked into the piece like this. It can be helpful to use a pin to pull the stitch line out to the edge as you go. If you're having a contrast lining at the back of the ties, like me, roll the lining in slightly to leave a small lip of the main body fabric at the edge for the neatest finish. And each tie should be 4 cm wide after pressing. Next, sew a line of top stitching 5 mm in from your finished edges, using a straight stitch with a length of 3 and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. Sew the top stitch the whole way round each tie in a continuous line, pivoting at the corners. So they should now look like this, and finish by giving each of the ties a really good press with your iron using plenty of steam and pressure. Step 7. Assemble shoulder straps. Take the 2 strap pieces that you fused earlier with interfacing and lay them on the table right side up. Then take the 2 strap pieces without interfacing and lay them right side down on top of them. So each strap pair should have 1 fused piece and 1 non-fused piece, with the right sides facing together. Match the edges of each pair and pin together. Then sew together as shown in the diagram, starting at the top right hand side using a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. Sew the whole way around the strap in one continuous line by using your needle as a pivot at the corners. And then repeat the process for the second strap. Give each of the straps a press flat with your iron, then trim down the seam allowances to about 4 mm and chop the points off at the corners, being careful to cut close to but not through your stitches. And turn each of the straps through the right way round with the chopstick, using the same method as for the ties in step 4. So they should now both look like this. And just like with the ties, we're going to roll the edges out so the stitch line is sitting right at the edge, not tucked into the fold, using a pin to help pull the edge out as you go. Press the straps into shape with your iron, and it's worth taking your time here to get a really crisp edge, as the straps will be quite a visible feature on the finished dungarees. Then fix the edges of the strap into place with a top stitch, using a straight stitch with a length of 3, 5 mm in from the finished edges, starting and ending with a back stitch. Start at the top right hand corner of the strap and sew the top stitch in one continuous line, using your needle as a pivot at the corners. Then press each strap nice and flat with your iron. So they should now look like this. Now take your set of dungaree hardware and we're going to attach the slider first. Take the finished end of the strap and pull it through the rectangular opening of the slider so that the slider bar sits on top of the fabric. Then loop the end of the strap over the top of the slider bar and back through the other side of the rectangular frame and add a pin to hold into place. Then adjust so the fold is 2 cm deep. Then change over to a zipper foot to avoid hitting the slider, and we're going to sew the fold down into place. Start with a backstitch to hold in place, then remove the pin and continue to sew with a straight stitch with a length of 3 back through the top stitching at the end of the strap, pulling the slider out of the way as you go and ending with a backstitch. And the finished result should look like this, and like this from the other side. Next, place the strap on the table with the fold you've just sewn facing upwards, and loop the other end of the strap over the top of it. Take your dungaree buckle and push the slider bar out of the way to the top. Then insert the raw end of the strap through the wide opening, under the buckle and then over the top of the slider bar. So it should now look like this, and like this from the other side. Then bring the end of the strap back through the buckle opening, over the top of the slider bar to the other side. So it will look like this, and like this from the other side. Then pull the buckle further down into the strap, and bring the end underneath the rectangular slider over the top of the fold we sewed earlier, and back under the side of the slider frame. So it should now look like this, and you'll be able to move the slider down the strap to adjust the length, with the buckle secured neatly in the loop at the end. Then repeat for the other strap and adjust to make the lengths roughly even. Don't worry too much about the length of the straps being exactly equal at the moment, as this can easily be adjusted on the finished dungarees to suit your body. And an interesting fact for you, most people have one shoulder slightly lower than the other, so you may find you end up adjusting one strap slightly tighter for the most symmetrical look on your body. Step 8. Sew inside leg seams. Lay your 2 front pieces on the table with the right sides facing up. Then take your back pieces and lay them right side down on top, matching the pieces up along the inside leg seam, which is this one here. Match the edges as closely as possible and pin at the bottom and the notch in the middle. You'll find the back piece will be slightly shorter than the front piece where it meets the crotch here. Pull the back piece up to match the front piece and pin into place. This will create a slight stretch in the back leg, which gives a smoother fit. Then add more pins along the rest of the seam as needed. And repeat on the other leg. Then sew the seams together with a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a backstitch at the beginning and the end. And seal the raw edge of the seam either with a serger or with a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. Give the seams a press flat, then push the seam allowance towards the back piece, which is the larger of the 2 pieces, and press into place from the front, using a pressing cloth to prevent shine if needed. So it will now look like this with the seam allowance pressed down towards the back piece. Then secure the seam allowance down into place with a top stitch, using a straight stitch with a length of 3, 5mm away from the join onto the back piece side. Pull the 2 pieces of cloth apart slightly as you sew to help get a nice even finish, and start and end with a backstitch. So it should now look like this, and like this from the back with the seam allowance held down neatly into place with the top stitch. And finally, give the seams a really good press with your iron using plenty of steam and pressure. Step 9. Sew crotch seam. We're now going to take the 2 pieces we've just sewn and sew them together around the crotch seam here. Lay the 2 pieces on the table right sides together and pin together, starting by matching up the inseams we've just sewn. Then match and pin the whole way around the crotch seam, matching the edges and notches as you go. Then sew together with a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a backstitch at the beginning and the end. Taking care to stay even around the curve where the seams meet, then seal the raw edge of the seam either on your serger or with a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. Press the seam flat with your iron, then push the seam allowance to one side, it doesn't matter which side this time, and press into place from the front with your iron. A sleeve board is really helpful for this part to help press around the curve without creating lots of wrinkles. Then fix the seam allowance down into place with a top stitch, using a straight stitch with a length of 3, 5mm away from the join between the pieces, pulling the 2 pieces of cloth apart as you go to get a nice flat finish, and starting and ending with a backstitch. Then give the seam another press with your iron using plenty of steam and pressure, and the finished result should look like this. Step 10. Sew front pocket. Lay your front pocket and front pocket lining pieces together with the right sides facing, and match and pin them along the top edge, which is the curve marked in the diagram here. Then sew them together with a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a backstitch at the beginning and the end. Press the seam flat, Then flip the lining up and press the seam allowance flat towards the lining side. Then flip the lining back down towards the pocket piece, and we're going to press the seam again, leaving a small lip of main body fabric a couple of millimeters deep at the top, so that the lining won't be visible from the outside of the dungarees. Press nice and firmly with your iron, so it should now look like this, and like this from the front, and we're going to fix the edge into place with a top stitch. It's a good idea to pin this first to stop the lining shifting as we sew, then use a straight stitch with a length of 3, 5 millimeters away from the edge with a back stitch at the beginning and the end. So it should now look like this from the front and like this from the back. Then flip over to the lining side and match and pin the pieces together around the 3 remaining raw edges, matching any notches as you go. And sew together using a big straight stitch with a length of 5, a 5mm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. You can sew all 3 edges in one continuous line by pivoting at the corners. Then give everything a really good press with your iron and make sure it's sitting nice and flat. Next, take your front bib piece and lay it on the table right side up. Then take the front pocket you've just sewn and lay it on top with the right side also facing up, aligning at the bottom of the pieces and leaving a gap at the top. And match and pin them together around the 3 raw edges of the pocket piece, aligning the notches as you go. And sew into place using a big straight stitch with a length of 5, a 5mm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end, sewing in one continuous line by pivoting at the corners. And give everything another good press flat with your iron. Step 11. Attach front pocket. Take the attached front and back pieces and lay them out on the table in a cross formation like this, with the right side facing up. This pointed end is the back, and this shorter end is the front, where we're going to attach the front pocket. Lay the front pocket piece with the sealed bottom edge you've just sewn above the top of the front pieces like this, and so the pocket opening is facing upwards. Then flip the pocket piece down so the right sides of the pocket and front pieces are facing together, and match and pin them along the curved edge. Then sew together with a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. Seal the raw edge of your seam with either a serger or a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. Press the seam flat, then flip the pocket up and press again from the front with the seam allowance facing up towards the pocket, and fix into place on the pocket side with a top stitch using a straight stitch with a length of 3, 5mm from the join with a back stitch at the beginning and the end, and give the seam a last press flat with your iron. Step 12. Sew sides and side pockets. Lay one of the side front pieces on the table right side up. Then take one of the lining pocket pieces and lay it right side down on top of it as shown here. Match the edges and notches of the straight seam as shown in the diagram and pin into place. Then repeat on the other side front piece and do exactly the same on the side backs with the remaining pocket pieces. Then sew together with a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. Finish the raw edges of the seams with either a serger or a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. Press the seams flat, then flip the pocket piece back over the seam allowance and press again. So all the pieces will now look like this, with the pocket pieces facing out and the seam allowances facing towards the lining. Then secure into place with a top stitch on the lining, using a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a couple of millimeters away from the join in the fabric, with a back stitch at the beginning and the end, and give all the seams another press flat with your iron. Next, lay one of the side front pieces onto the table with the right side facing up, and lay the corresponding side back piece on top of it with the right side facing down. Then match and pin the seam along the pocket side we've just sewn, matching and pinning all the way around the outer edge of the pocket, and aligning the notches and the edges as you go. We're now going to sew the 2 pieces together with the stitch line following the path shown in the diagram, using the chalk marks from the pattern to help us get a neat and precise shape. Start sewing the seam as normal with a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. Then, as you approach the first chalk dot, ignore your seam allowance guide and keep sewing in a straight line until you reach the mark. Then do exactly the same to keep sewing in a straight line up to the second chalk dot, stopping when you reach it and lowering your needle into the cloth. Then lift the presser foot and use the needle as a pivot to spin the fabric clockwise, so you're facing in the direction of the third chalk dot. Sew until you reach the mark, then gradually bring your seam allowance back to 1 centimetre around the outer curve of the pocket. Carry on the whole way round the pocket until you see the next set of chalk marks in front of you, and as you reach the end of the pocket lining, ignore the seam allowance again to sew towards the first chalk dot. Then do the same to sew towards the second chalk dot, stopping when you reach it and lowering your needle into the cloth to pivot the fabric clockwise until you're facing the third chalk dot and then sew down to meet it. Then sew down to the fourth and final chalk dot where you'll also find a notch. And from here you can now continue to sew to the end of the line as normal with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. And then repeat the process for the other side front and side back pieces. Finish the raw edges of the seams with either a serger or a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. Press the seams flat, then flip the longer side front piece over the seam allowance and pocket and press into place. So it will now look like this with the pocket sitting underneath the side front piece and the pocket opening pressed into shape and following the line of the seam. Now place a finger inside of the pocket and use chalk to mark a line at the beginning and the end of the pocket opening. Then mark 2 chalk dots along one of the lines at 5mm and 10mm in from the seam, and another chalk dot 15mm away from the pocket opening and 5mm in from the seam, and do the same at the other side of the pocket opening. So it should now look like this, and we'll use these marks to sew neat little triangles at either end of the pocket opening when we top stitch. Start your top stitch with a back stitch in the same way we've done before, using a straight stitch with a length of 3, 5mm away from the join in the fabric, catching the side front down onto the seam allowance. As you approach the chalk dots, ignore the first one, then sew down until you reach the second dot, lowering your needle into the cloth at the mark. Then pivot the fabric 90 degrees and sew a couple of stitches across to the next chalk dot. Then pivot again to sew at a diagonal back up to the first chalk dot and end with a back stitch. So you'll have a little triangle of stitches that looks like this. Then fix the rest of the seam into place with another top stitch, starting at the hem with a back stitch and heading up towards the other side of the pocket opening. Make sure the pocket is laying nice and flat underneath the side front piece as you sew, and then repeat the process of forming the little triangle of stitches as you reach the dots at the end of the line. Always sew from the ends of the seam with the triangle last for this part, as it's much easier to get a neat finish. Repeat for both sides and then iron everything nice and flat. So the opening of the pocket should now look like this, with the little triangles helping to keep everything in place and hanging nicely when you wear the dungarees. Step 13. Attach ties. Lay one of the side pieces you've just sewn onto the table right side up. Then take a pair of your waist ties, making sure they're a matching pair that mirror each other like this, and a matching pair of your ankle ties if you're adding them. Then pin the ties right side up to the outer edges of the side seam as shown here. You'll find notches at the sides to get the positions correct, and repeat for both sides. Then sew all the ties into place with a big straight stitch with a length of 5, a 5mm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the ends. Step 14. Attach sides. Lay the attached front and back pieces onto the table with the right side facing up, spread out in a cross formation like this. This is the front, and this is the back, and these two wider parts are the legs. Bring the bottom of the two legs to meet and flip the back underneath the front as I'm doing here. So you now have the two legs facing downwards as they would be when you're wearing the dungarees. And we're going to attach our side pieces to the edge of our front pieces here. Take one of your side pieces and lay it right side down, so the side front part of the piece that has the little square of interfacing is matching up with the edge of the front bib and front leg, and pin into place, matching the edges and notches as you go, and making sure the ties are sitting flat away from the seam in towards the garment. Then flip that side piece back and repeat the process on the other side with the other side front piece. Then sew the seams together with a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. making sure the ties are lying nice and flat as you sew through them. Seal the raw edges of the seam with either a serger or a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. Press the seams flat, then push the seam allowance towards the side pieces and press into place from the front, using a pressing cloth to prevent shine if needed, and keeping the ties out of the way of the seam with the wrong side of the tie facing up. Then fix the seam into place with a top stitch in the same way we've done before, using a straight stitch with a length of 3, 5mm away from the join onto the side front piece, catching the seam allowance down as you go, keeping the ties out of the way for the moment, and starting and finishing the line with a backstitch. Give the seams a press flat with your iron, and then flip the ties back over the seam, so the right side of the tie is facing up and press into place. And we're going to sew a line of stitches through the ties 5mm away from the join to hold them down into place. Start your stitching from the line of top stitching on the tie rather than its edge, and sew 5mm away from the join up to the other line of top stitching, beginning and ending with a backstitch. Press over the stitches with your iron, and the finished result should look like this, with the stitches holding the ties down towards the sides and the little gaps at the end of the stitching preventing the stitches from being pulled or broken when you wear the dungarees. Step 15. Prepare hems. The dungarees should now look like this when you lay them out flat, and we're going to prep the hems before we sew up the back by sealing the raw edge and ironing up a hemfold of 3cm at the bottom. It's a little bit easier to do this part now than when the legs are sealed in a loop, but if you want to try the dungarees on and check the length of the legs first, you can leave this step till the end. Use your serger or a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine to seal the raw edge at the bottom of each leg. Then, with the wrong side of the hems facing up, fold over 3cm at the notches and press into place with your iron. We'll finish the rest of the hem later on, so you'll still have a chance to check the length and adjust if you want to. Step 16. Prepare facings. Take your front facing piece and lay it against the pattern. The top of the facing should have the notches you see here, and there are no notches across the bottom, which is where we're going to sew our bias binding to neatly seal the raw edge. Flip your facing piece to the back, and we're going to sew our first line of stitches to attach the binding by opening up one of the binding folds, then matching the raw edge of the binding to the raw edge of the bottom of the facing and sewing into the groove of the fold here. I prefer not to pin this as I think you get a more even finish, so start slowly with a backstitch to secure, then take your time matching the edges as you go, with the stitches falling as closely as possible into the fold on the bias binding. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, stopping when you reach the end of the facing with a backstitch, and trim away any extra binding. So it should now look like this, and then trim the seam allowance down to about 5mm, taking care to trim evenly along the line. So it should now look like this. Then turn to the front of the facing and flip the folded edge of the binding over your stitches so it looks like this, and we're going to fix it neatly down into place with another line of stitching. Again, I prefer to fold this as I go rather than pin it for a more even finish. So as before, start with a backstitch to secure and take your time, folding the binding over as you go and sewing a line of straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a millimetre or 2 away from the folded edge. So it should now look like this, and give everything a nice press from the front. And then repeat the process with the back facing, opening the binding and sewing it to the back first, taking extra care around the curve in the middle of the back facing piece as this part can be a little tricky. As before, trim the seam allowance down to 5mm, then flip the binding over the stitches onto the front and secure into place with another line of stitches close to the edge of the binding, and give the binding a last press over with your iron. Step 17. Finish front and sides. Lay your dungarees on the table right side up, with the bib where the front pocket is spread out like this. Then take your front facing with the binding facing downwards, and lay it right side down over the top part of the bib. Then match and pin the 3 raw edges of the facing to the top of the bib, aligning any notches as you go. Then sew the facing into place along the 3 raw edges in one continuous line, pivoting at the corners. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a backstitch at the beginning and the end. Next, take one of your side binding pieces or your pre-made bias binding, open out one of the folds and align the raw edge to the top right hand edge of the bib, starting about halfway down the facing piece. Start with a backstitch to secure, then use a straight stitch to sew as close as possible into the groove of the binding fold, while aligning the raw edge of the binding to the raw edge of the bib, sewing all the way around the curve at the sides to the end of the side back piece. As before, I find you get a better finish by doing this without pinning, but do take your time when you're doing this part to make sure you get a nice finish. When you get to the end of the side back, finish with a backstitch and chop down any extra binding. So it should now look like this, with the binding starting halfway through the facing at the top, and then a line of stitching running along the groove of the fold about 7 mm away from the raw edge. And repeat on the other side so it looks like this. We're now going to sew a line of top stitching to catch the seam allowance at the top of the bib to the front facing. This line of stitching will be in the middle section of the bib only, and will start from the seam where the side front meets the front bib piece. Lift the facing out of the way and push the seam allowance towards it. Then fix into place with a straight stitch with a length of 3, a couple of millimeters away from the join onto the facing side, starting and ending with a backstitch. So it should now look like this, and like this from the back with the seam allowance caught down against the facing. Trim down the seam allowance on the top corners like this. Then take an orange stick or something similar and flip the facing the right way around, using the orange stick to help push out the corners for a neat crisp finish, and press into place with your iron. Then fold your binding towards the inside of the dungarees, leaving a lip of a couple of millimeters of the main body fabric at the edge, and press into place with your iron on both sides. Leaving the small lip of main body fabric helps us get a clean finish, and stops the binding being visible from the outside of the dungarees. We're now going to sew the binding into place with a line of stitches running along the edge of the fold the whole way around the curve, stopping when we meet the stitch line on the facing binding. We're then going to pivot and continue sewing along that stitch line out towards the edge of the bib. Use a straight stitch for this with a length of 2.5, a couple of millimeters away from the folded edge of the binding, which should fall approximately ½ an inch from the outer edge of the side. As you approach the facing, make sure it's laying nice and flat, and continue your stitches onto the facing piece up to the line of stitches on the binding. Then use your needle as a pivot to continue sewing in a continuous line across the stitches on the facing binding out to the edge of the bib and end with a backstitch. Then repeat the process on the other side, this time starting at the stitching on the facing binding, then pivoting at ½ an inch in to sew down close to the folded edge of the binding. Then give both sides another press with your iron. Next, we have another line of stitches to make sure the front facing stays down in place when you're wearing the dungarees, and this is going to fall just inside the top of the front pocket. Put a few pins into the top section of the bib from the front first to make sure it's sitting nicely. Then flip over to the back and add some more pins, making sure to go through the facing and front bib piece only without catching the front pocket. Then remove the first set of pins. Take a chalk pencil and add a dot mark onto the stitching on the facing binding, 1 inch away from the side front seams on both sides. We're now going to run a line of stitches from one dot to the other, using the stitches on the facing binding as a guide. You'll need to fold the front pocket down out of the way for this part, as it's really important we don't catch it while sewing. Then starting at the first chalk dot with a backstitch, use a straight stitch with a length of 2.5 to follow the line of stitches on the facing binding as closely as possible, up until you reach the second chalk mark and end with a backstitch. Then give the whole top a last press with your iron. So it should now look like this from the back, with the binding caught down in the middle and with the stitches blending into the stitches on the facing binding. And like this from the front, with a ½ inch top stitch squared off at the sides, and the last set of stitches hidden inside the opening of the front pocket. Step 18. Sew side back seam. Lay your dungarees out on the table with the right side facing up. Then take your back section, which is this part, and bring it up over the top of the front bib so that the right sides are together. Then making sure your ties are tucked in towards the right side of the garment, bring the bottom of the back trouser leg over to the bottom of the side back piece and pin into place. So the leg should now be in a sealed loop at the bottom with the right sides facing in. Then continue to match and pin the whole way up the rest of the seam, aligning the edges and the notches as you go, up until the point where the side back piece ends. Then do exactly the same on the other side, shifting the position of the dungarees if needed. Then at the point where the side back starts, sew the seam together using a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. Sew just the seam lines for now without sealing the raw edges, as we'll be doing that part in the next step. Step 19. Attach back straps and back facing. Lay the dungarees on the table with the back facing up. Then make a chalk mark 1 cm down from the pointed tip of the back piece. Then take your straps and flip them over so the slider is facing down towards the right side of the back, and match the raw edges up to the top edge of the back using the notches as a guide, and making sure you can still see the chalk mark and pin into place. So they should be sitting like this, with the straps crossed over each other and going down towards the back piece, with the wrong side of the straps facing up towards you. And it's really important to make sure you can still see the chalk mark at the point where the two straps cross, as this stops the straps getting bunched together at the next stage. Then sew the straps into place using a big stitch with a length of 5, a 5mm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. So it should now look like this, with the chalk mark still visible. Then with the top of the back right side up, tuck the sides of the dungarees and all of the straps and ties into the middle. Then take your back facing with the wrong side facing up and match it to the top of the back, sandwiching the sides, straps and ties between the layers. The chalk dot on the back facing from the pattern should align exactly with the chalk dot between the straps. Put a pin through both to hold them in position together. Then match the edges of the facing up with the edges of the back piece and pin into place, aligning the notches as you go. Then sew the facing in place using a straight stitch with a length of 2.5, a 1 cm seam allowance and a back stitch at the beginning and the end. Sew in one continuous line, pivoting at the corners and being careful to pivot exactly at the chalk mark at the top point. So it should now look like this, with the straps and side pieces sandwiched between the back and the back facing. Step 20. Finish back. We're now going to finish the raw edges of the side back seams starting from the points here. You can use your serger for this or a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. So it should now look like this. Then turn the facing the right way round and pull out the straps to check they're sitting nicely and not caught together. Then flip the facing back around to the wrong side and trim the seam allowance down to about 5mm on the two sides shown here. Then cut into the tip at the top of the facing in a triangle shape, being careful to cut close to but not through your stitches or the straps. Then turn the facing the right way round again and pull the straps out firmly to get a nice shape at the top. Then turn the back over to the inside and press the shape in with your iron, working the edges out as you go and making sure everything is sitting really nice and flat where the back facing meets the side back seams. Then press the edge finishing flat the rest of the way down the side back seams. We're now going to push the side back seam allowances towards the back pieces and turn the dungarees the right way round to press them into place from the front. A sleeve board is helpful to get inside the legs while doing this, and use a pressing cloth to prevent shine if needed. Make sure the ties are sitting out of the way of the seam towards the side pieces. So your dungarees should now look like this, and the last thing we're going to do with the side back seams is to run a top stitch from the bottom of the left leg all the way up around the edge of the top back and down to the bottom of the right leg. Put your hand inside the left leg of the dungarees out to the hem opening, and it's this section at the bottom where the side back seam meets the hem that we need to get under the machine foot first. This can be a little bit tricky to manoeuvre, and you need to work the fabric underneath the presser foot almost as if you're sewing backwards. Then have the presser foot sitting in the hole at the bottom of the trouser leg before you start sewing to make sure you're not catching the front of the trousers as you sew. Start with a back stitch at the hem and then use a straight stitch with a length of 3, 5mm away from the join in the fabric on the back piece side, catching the seam allowance underneath as you go. Keep going all the way up along the long side back seam, keeping the ties out of the way, and then continue around the top edge of the back. So in one continuous line, pivoting at the corners, then continue down the side back seam on the other side, making sure you're sewing onto the back piece and catching the seam allowance as you go. Pull the two pieces of fabric apart to get a nice flat finish, and keep sewing the whole way down until you reach the hem of the other leg. So it will now look like this at the top. And we're now going to flip to the inside and fix down the bottom edge of the back facing, following the line of stitches on the binding. Add a few pins first to hold the facing down into place, then start sewing at the point where the top stitch on the binding meets the top stitch we've just sewn on the side back seams for a nice finish. And run your stitches as closely as possible to the stitches on the binding, using a stitch length of 3, with a back stitch at the beginning and the end, stopping when you reach the line of side back top stitching on the other side. So it should now look like this from the back, and like this from the front, with a neat line of stitches following the curved shape of the facing. Then finally, give everything you've sewn in this step a really good press with your iron, using plenty of steam and pressure, and making sure to work the whole way down both legs. Step 21. Attach buttons. First, mark the button position by laying a ruler from the side front seam to the point where the side top stitching meets the edge, and draw a chalk line lightly in the middle. Then lay the ruler down again from the top corner of the pocket to the top corner of the front bib, and draw another line lightly in the middle to form a cross. The middle of this cross gives us the button position, and we can make sure the buttons are exactly even by folding the bib in half, matching the edges exactly, and then placing a pin through the cross to mark the position on the other side. So you should now have 2 dots that look like this, and we need to make a small hole in them, using the tip at the end of your snips or something similar. Then take your hammer-on buttons, which will come in 2 parts, with a button front and a small tack for the back. Place the tacks through the holes from the back, so they're pointing up through the front of the bib. There should be a little bit of resistance when doing this, but don't be tempted to make the holes too much bigger, as this will result in wobbly buttons that may come loose. Next, take the front of the buttons, a hammer, and a small piece of thick soft fabric to protect the front of the button and your table. Lay the button face down onto the fabric piece, then take the bib with the tack and place it with the wrong side up towards you, so the point of the tack is going down into the middle of the back of the button, and hammer the back of the tack firmly to fix into place. Check the join is tight and give it another hammer if needed. So the buttons should now be tight with the fabric sandwiched between the hardware pieces, and they should now look like this, ready to clip on to your buckles. Step 22. Finish hems. We're now going to finish the bottom of our hems. If you're checking the length of your dungarees first, you can try the dungarees on now and then refer back to step 15 for the first stage of the hems. Make sure the hem fold is crisp where it meets the side back seam. Then pin the hem down into place the whole way around each leg from the inside. Find the inside leg seam by working down the leg from the crotch, and use this as your starting point for a neat finish. Then sew the hem into place using a straight stitch with a length of 3, a 2.5cm seam allowance, and a back stitch at the beginning and the end, working the whole way around the hem in a loop until you reach back at the point where you started. Then give the hems a really good last press from the front, using a pressing cloth to prevent shine if needed and plenty of steam and pressure. Thanks so much for watching. If you're sewing along at home, I hope you have an amazing new pair of dungarees in front of you right now and you're feeling super proud of yourself. Seeing the pieces you create with my patterns is one of my favourite things, so please do tag me if you share any photos of your make. And it's lovely to see both the finished pieces and the work in progress. You can find me on TikTok and Instagram at Sasha__Starlight, and you can use the hashtag Starlight Dungarees for this project. This is my longest and most complex project so far, so I'd love to know how you found it for sewing along at home. Was there enough detail to guide you through, or even maybe a little bit too much? And did you enjoy the challenge of a longer, more technical make? Or would you prefer to see more of my speedier, simpler designs in the future? Let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to get involved with picking the styles for my future pattern releases, keep an eye on my stories over on Instagram, as I'm going to be designing some new pieces for autumn over the next few weeks, and I'd love to know what you'd like to see next. But for now, I hope your new dungarees bring you all the joy for many years to come, and I'll see you next time.